He thought rejecting her would be just another routine decision, but he had no idea he was denying the woman who owned everything around him. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Hannah Brooks. The marble floors of Atlantic Crest Bank reflected the morning light like a polished mirror, casting a soft glow across the towering glass walls and the quiet hum of wealth moving through the air. Tailored suits, leather briefcases, voices low and confident. Everything about the place whispered exclusivity. And then she walked in. Hannah Brooks stepped through the revolving doors wearing a simple beige cardigan, dark jeans, and flat shoes. Her hair loosely tied back. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry. Just a quiet presence that didn't seem to belong in a place where appearances were currency. And almost instantly, eyes turned, not with curiosity, but with judgment. The receptionist glanced up, her smile flickering for half a second before settling into something more mechanical, something distant, as if she had already decided Hannah was not worth the effort. Hannah didn't react, her posture steady, her gaze calm. She moved forward with measured steps, the faint echo of her shoes against the marble floor sounding louder than it should have, as though the building itself was questioning her presence. Behind the front desk, two employees exchanged a quick glance, one raising an eyebrow, the other suppressing a smirk, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of silent conversation that said everything without a single word. Hannah stopped at the counter, placing a thin folder gently on the polished surface, her fingers resting lightly on top of it. Her voice when she spoke was soft, but clear. "Good morning. I'm here to verify my ownership status." And for a brief moment, time seemed to hesitate. The receptionist blinked, her expression shifting from indifference to confusion, then to disbelief, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Ownership. Here, in one of the most exclusive private banks in the city, from a woman dressed like she had just come from a weekend errand. A faint chuckle escaped from one of the employees nearby, quickly covered by a cough, but not quickly enough. The air changed, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like the first ripple before a wave. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, her tone tightening, polite on the surface but edged with something colder underneath. There must be some kind of misunderstanding. Her eyes flicked briefly to the folder, then back to Hannah, scanning her again as if hoping to find evidence that justified the doubt already forming in her mind. Hannah didn't move, didn't flinch. Her expression remained composed, almost serene, as if she had expected this exact moment, as if she had walked into this room already knowing how it would unfold. Around her, the quiet murmur of the bank continued, but there was a shift now, a subtle awareness. A few more glances, a few more whispers, the kind of attention that builds before something breaks. And somewhere deep within the polished walls and practiced smiles of Atlantic Crest Bank, a mistake had just been made, one that would soon echo far louder than anyone in that room was prepared for. The receptionist's smile tightened just enough to reveal the shift from confusion to quiet dismissal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard without actually typing, as though the request in front of her did not warrant even the effort of verification. "Ownership status," she repeated, slower this time, the words sounding almost foreign in her mouth. And behind her, one of the employees let out a soft laugh that blended into the background chatter but lingered just long enough to be noticed. Hannah remained still, her hands resting lightly on the folder, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present, and that calm seemed to irritate more than any argument could have. "Ma'am," the receptionist continued, her tone now carrying a polished edge of authority, "this institution handles private accounts and high-level ownership structures. So if you are looking to open a standard account, I can direct you to the appropriate department." She gestured vaguely toward a side corridor without making eye contact, already attempting to redirect the situation. A second employee leaned closer, whispering something that caused the receptionist's lips to curl slightly. And then she added, louder this time, "Ownership claims require prior appointments and verified credentials, not walk-ins." The emphasis on the last two words hung in the air like a quiet accusation. A couple seated nearby paused their conversation, glancing over with mild curiosity, their expressions carrying that familiar mix of judgment and entertainment, as if they had just been handed an unexpected distraction to break the monotony of their morning. Hannah slowly opened the folder, sliding a set of documents forward across the counter, the paper catching the light as it moved, precise, deliberate. "I have the documentation," she said, her voice even, unshaken. And for a brief second, the receptionist hesitated, her eyes flicking down to the papers before, quickly pulling back as if refusing to validate them would somehow erase their legitimacy. "Anyone can print documents." The employee behind her interjected with a quiet chuckle, not even attempting to lower his voice this time. "That does not make them real," and the comment drew a few more subtle smiles from those within earshot. The room began to lean into the moment, the invisible line between private interaction and public spectacle dissolving with each passing second. Hannah did not respond to the remark, did not defend herself, did not raise her voice. Instead, she simply waited, her silence stretching longer than expected, creating a tension that no one seemed willing to acknowledge but everyone could feel. The receptionist exhaled softly, as if losing patience with something she did not fully understand, and finally reached for the documents, her fingers brushing against the edge with reluctance. She glanced over them quickly, too quickly, her eyes skimming rather than reading, searching not for truth but for a reason to dismiss. "These appear incomplete," she said after barely a moment, sliding them back with a practiced motion, her tone now firm, final. "And even if they were not, this is not how ownership verification works here." Her gaze lifted, meeting Hannah's for the first time with a thin, controlled smile that carried no warmth. "You will need to schedule an appointment through the proper channels, assuming there is something to verify at all." And that last line, delivered just slightly louder than necessary, landed exactly as intended. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the nearby customers. A few exchanged glances. One man shook his head with a faint smirk, as if the outcome had been obvious from the start. Hannah closed the folder slowly, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. But in the stillness that followed, something subtle shifted, something beneath the surface, like a calm that had decided to stay just a little longer before the inevitable turn, and though no one in that room realized it yet, the moment they had just dismissed so casually was already beginning to reshape everything they thought they understood. The faint smirk on the receptionist's face lingered as she turned slightly toward her colleague, as if the matter had already been settled, as if the woman standing in front of her had been quietly erased from relevance. And yet Hannah did not move, did not step away, did not argue. She simply stood there with a stillness that began to feel out of place in a room built on constant motion and quiet transactions. A man in a tailored gray suit, seated a few feet away, leaned back in his chair, watching with mild amusement, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest as though he were waiting for the inevitable conclusion, while another customer adjusted her sunglasses and whispered something under her breath, drawing a soft laugh from her companion. The atmosphere had shifted fully now, no longer just dismissive, but observant, the kind of attention that feeds on discomfort, and yet Hannah offered none of it. Her expression remained composed, her breathing steady, her eyes focused, not on the people around her, but on the woman behind the counter who had just denied her without hesitation. "Is there someone else I can speak to?" Hannah asked calmly, her voice cutting gently through the low hum of conversation, and for a brief moment, the receptionist hesitated, not because she doubted her answer, but because the question itself refused to dissolve as easily as the others had. "There is a process," the receptionist replied, her tone sharpening slightly. "And you have already been informed of it." She straightened her posture, as though reinforcing the invisible barrier between them. "We cannot escalate every claim that walks through the door." The choice of words deliberate, reducing Hannah's presence to just another inconvenience. The employee behind her leaned forward again, unable to resist adding to the moment. "Especially when there is no verifiable record," he said, his voice just loud enough to reach the surrounding ears, and a few heads nodded subtly, as if agreement required no evidence. Hannah listened, her gaze steady, and then she nodded once, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming something only she understood, her fingers lightly tapped the edge of the folder before she closed it completely, the soft sound echoing more than it should have in the polished space. "I understand," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, and that response seemed to catch the receptionist off guard more than any protest would have, because there was no resistance to push against, no emotion to dismiss. Only a quiet acceptance that did not match the narrative they had already decided for her. A second passed, then another, and the receptionist shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the lack of reaction, her eyes flicking toward the security desk for a brief moment before returning to Hannah, as if considering whether to end the interaction more forcefully. But Hannah did not give her that opportunity. She simply remained where she was, her presence unwavering, her silence stretching just long enough to create a subtle tension that no one could quite explain. Across the room, the glass doors at the entrance rotated slowly as someone new stepped inside, the movement barely noticeable at first, just another arrival in a place where people came and went without consequence. But there was something different in the way the guard near the entrance straightened his posture, something in the way a nearby employee instinctively adjusted his tie. A shift so small it could have been dismissed, yet it rippled quietly through the space. Hannah did not turn, did not look toward the entrance, as if she already knew what was coming, as if the moment unfolding behind her had been inevitable from the very beginning. And while the receptionist prepared to dismiss her one final time, the air itself seemed to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that those paying attention began to feel it, a subtle pause, a breath held across polished marble and quiet judgment, just before everything began to tilt in a direction none of them had anticipated. The subtle shift at the entrance did not announce itself with noise, but with attention, the kind that moved quietly from one person to another like a ripple across still water. The security guard near the glass doors straightened fully now, his posture no longer casual, his eyes fixed forward with a sudden alertness that did not go unnoticed by the employees closest to him. And one by one, conversations softened, not stopped, just lowered enough to make space for something else. The man who had just stepped inside did not rush, his pace measured, deliberate, each step landing with quiet confidence against the marble floor, the soft echo carrying farther than expected, his presence arriving before any introduction could. Dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit with effortless precision, his posture upright, his expression calm but focused, and though no one had spoken his name yet, recognition began to flicker in small, involuntary reactions, a teller adjusting her stance, a junior associate lowering his voice mid-sentence, a manager across the room subtly turning his body to face the entrance. Behind the counter, the receptionist felt it too, a slight tightening in her shoulders, a hesitation she could not quite explain, and for the first time since Hannah had approached, her attention shifted away, just for a moment, her eyes glancing toward the entrance before quickly returning, as if reminding herself to stay in control of the situation unfolding in front of her. "As I was saying," she began, attempting to reclaim the moment, her voice slightly louder now. "Without proper verification, there is nothing more we can do." The words firm, final, designed to close the interaction, and yet they did not land with the same certainty as before. Hannah remained still, her gaze steady, her silence unchanged, and in that stillness, something almost imperceptible happened. She exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in quiet patience, as though allowing the room to catch up to what was already inevitable. The man continued walking, not directly toward the counter at first, but along the main aisle, his eyes scanning the room with calm awareness, taking in the details, the people, the energy, and then, as if guided by something unseen, his attention settled on the front desk, on the small gathering that had formed, on the woman standing alone in front of it. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, subtle but unmistakable, and his direction shifted. Without hesitation, a nearby customer who had been watching with mild amusement straightened suddenly. His expression changing as realization dawned, he leaned toward his companion, whispering something urgent, and within seconds, that quiet recognition began to spread, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the tone of the room began to shift from casual observation to uneasy awareness. The employee behind the receptionist noticed it next, his smirk fading as he followed the line of sight toward the approaching figure, his posture stiffening, his earlier confidence dissolving into something far less certain. The receptionist felt at last the change in the air that no longer supported her authority in the same way, the subtle weight pressing against her certainty, and before she could fully process it, a voice, calm, measured, and unmistakably controlled, spoke from just behind Hannah. "Is there a reason my wife is being denied service?" The words were not loud, but they carried, cutting cleanly through the room. And in that single moment, the carefully constructed narrative that had surrounded Hannah began to fracture. The laughter, the whispers, the quiet judgments, all of it, suspended mid-air as the room turned, not toward her, but toward him, and the realization, slow at first, then undeniable, began to take hold. The words did not echo loudly, but they landed with a precision that silenced everything around them, as if the air itself had decided to pause and listen, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The receptionist's expression froze mid-reaction, her carefully maintained composure cracking just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. Hannah did not turn immediately. She remained facing forward for a second longer, as though allowing the weight of the question to settle fully into the room. Then slowly, she shifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his with quiet familiarity. No surprise, no urgency, just recognition, as if this moment had been expected all along. Alexander Brooks stood just behind her, his presence steady, his posture relaxed but unmistakably authoritative, his eyes focused not on the crowd, not on the whispers that had already begun to ripple again, but directly on the receptionist, and that focus alone seemed to narrow the entire space down to a single point of tension. The receptionist opened her mouth to respond, but the words did not come as easily as before. Her voice, when it finally surfaced, lacked the sharp certainty it once carried. "Sir, I was simply explaining that there are procedures," she began, her tone attempting to recover its professional edge, but the slight tremor beneath it betrayed her. This individual made a claim that could not be verified. She gestured faintly toward Hannah without fully looking at her, as if distancing herself from the situation might somehow restore control. A faint murmur passed through the nearby customers, but it was different now. No longer amused, no longer dismissive, but curious, cautious, as if they were witnessing a shift they did not yet fully understand. Alexander did not respond immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to draw every eye toward him, to make every second feel intentional. And then he stepped forward, closing the small distance between himself and the counter, the soft sound of his shoes against the marble floor, marking each movement with quiet finality. "You reviewed her documents?" he asked, his voice calm, measured, not raised, yet carrying a weight that made interruption unthinkable. The receptionist hesitated, her eyes flicking down to the folder still resting on the counter, then back up. "I glanced at them," she admitted, the word itself sounding smaller than she intended. Alexander's gaze did not shift, did not soften. "And you determined they were invalid?" he continued, not as a question, but as a statement that required acknowledgement. The receptionist swallowed slightly, her earlier confidence slipping further. "They appeared incomplete," she replied, choosing her words carefully now, aware of how they sounded. Behind her, the employee who had laughed earlier stood unnaturally still, his hands clasped together as if trying to disappear into the background. Hannah remained silent, her presence unchanged. But now the room no longer saw her the same way. Something had shifted. Something irreversible, and though no one had yet spoken it aloud, the realization was beginning to form. Alexander reached forward, his hand resting lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, just touching it, grounding the moment. "Then allow me to clarify," he said quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, only certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And as he finally opened the folder, the room leaned in without meaning to, drawn by something they could not name, while the receptionist, for the first time since the interaction began, felt the full weight of doubt settle into her chest, the kind that comes just before understanding arrives, and with it, the realization that everything she had assumed might have been wrong. The sound of paper shifting was almost too quiet for the moment it carried, Yet every eye in the room seemed drawn to it as Alexander Brooks opened the folder with deliberate care, his movements unhurried, precise, as if he understood that time itself had already slowed to accommodate what was about to unfold. The receptionist leaned forward slightly despite herself, her earlier reluctance replaced by a growing need to see, to confirm, to understand. And as the first page was turned toward her, the faint color in her face began to drain, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those closest to the counter. The document was not cluttered, not confusing. It was clean, structured, official, the kind of paperwork that did not invite interpretation but demanded acknowledgement. And at the top, in clear, unmistakable print, was a name that carried weight far beyond the room, a name that had been referenced in meetings, in reports, in quiet conversations about ownership and control. Alexander did not point to it immediately. He allowed her eyes to find it on their own, allowed the realization to arrive without interruption, and when it did, it was not loud, not sudden, but heavy, settling into her expression like a truth she could not push away. "This institution," he said calmly, his voice steady, "is held under Brooks Financial Holdings." He paused just long enough for the words to register, then continued. "And as of last quarter, the majority controlling interest was transferred." His gaze shifted slightly toward Hannah, not as a reveal, but as a confirmation of something that had always been true, to Hannah Brooks. The name landed with a finality that silenced even the faintest whisper. The employee behind the receptionist took an involuntary step back, his earlier confidence dissolving completely, his eyes darting between the document and Hannah, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the reality now unfolding. The man in the gray suit who had been watching leaned forward, his expression no longer amused, but stunned, his fingers no longer tapping, now completely still. The receptionist's lips parted slightly, but no words followed, her mind moving quickly, retracing every moment of the interaction, every assumption, every dismissal, each one now echoing louder than the last. Alexander closed the folder halfway, not hiding the document, but no longer offering it for scrutiny, as if the proof had already served its purpose. "You did not verify," he said, not accusing, not raising his voice, simply stating a fact that could not be undone. "You assumed," and that single word seemed to carry more weight than any reprimand could have. Hannah remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not triumphant, not vindictive, but steady, as though the outcome had never been in question. The room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped by realization, by the slow understanding that something fundamental had been overlooked. A manager from across the floor began moving toward the counter, his pace quick, but controlled, his expression tense, aware that the situation had shifted beyond routine correction. The receptionist finally found her voice, though it came softer now, stripped of its earlier authority. "I did not realize," she began, but the sentence lingered unfinished because realization, in this moment, was not enough to change what had already happened. Alexander's gaze remained steady, not harsh, not forgiving, simply present, and in that presence, the truth settled fully into the room, that the woman they had dismissed, the one they had quietly ridiculed, had never been out of place. They had simply failed to recognize where they stood. The manager reached the counter just as the last words settled into silence, his breath slightly elevated, his expression carefully controlled but unable to mask the urgency behind it. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice respectful, almost cautious, as he adjusted his jacket, "we were not informed you would be visiting today." His eyes briefly shifted to Hannah, then back again, recalibrating in real time. "And certainly not under these circumstances." The sentence chosen with precision, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. Alexander did not respond immediately, his gaze still resting on the receptionist for a moment longer before shifting to the manager, the transition subtle but deliberate, as if passing the weight of the situation from one to another. "It appears the circumstances did not require prior notice," he replied calmly, and though his tone remained even, the meaning behind it landed with quiet force. The manager nodded once, quickly, acknowledging both the statement and the implication. "Of course," he said, turning slightly toward the receptionist, his expression tightening just enough to signal that the situation had moved beyond her control. "I will handle this," he added, the words directed more as instruction than reassurance. The receptionist stepped back half an inch, not commanded, but compelled, her earlier certainty now replaced with a careful stillness. Her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, as if grounding herself in a moment that had shifted too quickly to follow. Behind her, the employee who had spoken earlier lowered his gaze entirely, his shoulders subtly drawn inward, the quiet confidence he once carried now nowhere to be found. The manager extended a hand toward the folder, but paused before touching it, his eyes meeting Hannah's for the first time with full awareness. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his tone measured, respectful, and unmistakably different from what had come before. "Please accept our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding hung in the air, fragile, insufficient, yet offered as the only bridge available. Hannah regarded him calmly, her expression unchanged, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology, simply observing it, allowing it to exist without giving it immediate weight. "Your documentation will be reviewed properly," the manager continued, his voice steady, "and your ownership status will be confirmed through the appropriate channels without delay." Each phrase carefully constructed, each word an attempt to restore order to a moment that had already slipped beyond routine correction. Alexander watched the exchange without interruption, his presence still, his silence intentional, allowing the manager to speak, to adjust, to acknowledge, but not to erase what had already occurred. Around them, the room remained quiet, not out of politeness, but out of recognition, the kind that follows when something undeniable has been revealed. The man in the gray suit shifted in his seat, no longer leaning back, no longer entertained, his posture now attentive, almost respectful, while the woman with the sunglasses lowered them slightly, her earlier expression replaced with a more measured curiosity. Hannah finally spoke, her voice soft, steady, carrying just enough to reach those closest. "It was not a misunderstanding," she said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the careful language that had been building. "It was a decision," she added, her eyes resting briefly on the receptionist, not accusing, not harsh, but clear, and in that clarity, the distinction became undeniable. The manager's lips pressed together for a moment, acknowledging the truth in her words, unable to refute it, and in the silence that followed, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a quiet understanding that respect, once withheld, could not simply be offered again without consequence, and that the moment they had dismissed so casually had now become the moment that defined them. The manager's carefully measured tone lingered in the air, but it no longer held the authority it once might have carried, because the room had already decided what this moment meant, not through words, but through the quiet shift in how every person now stood, now watched, now understood. Alexander remained still for a brief second longer, his gaze moving slowly across the counter, taking in the receptionist, the employee behind her, the manager attempting to regain control, and then he spoke. Again, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that did not invite interpretation. "Procedures exist to ensure accuracy," he said, his eyes settling back on the manager, "not to justify dismissal," and the distinction settled heavily, leaving no space for argument. The manager nodded once, more firmly this time, as if accepting not just the correction, but the responsibility that came with it. "You are absolutely right," he replied, his tone now stripped of any pretense, "and we will address this immediately." He turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the receptionist, and though he did not raise his voice, the change in his expression was enough. "Step away from the desk," he instructed quietly, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond her authority. The receptionist hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, then complied, her movements careful, her posture no longer defensive, but withdrawn, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness of what had unfolded. The employee beside her followed without being told, stepping back, his gaze lowered, avoiding the eyes of those who had witnessed his earlier remarks. The manager moved forward, positioning himself behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on the surface as he faced Hannah directly. "Mrs. Brooks," he said again, "this Time with full recognition. Your ownership will be formally acknowledged and updated across all internal systems immediately. Each word deliberate, precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. And a full review of this interaction will be conducted, he added, not as a threat, but as a statement of consequence. Hannah listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, but carried clearly. Recognition is not what was missing, she said, her eyes briefly meeting his, then shifting across the room, taking in the silent audience. Respect was, and the simplicity of the statement settled deeper than any formal apology could have. A hush followed, not forced, not dramatic, but natural, as if the room itself had absorbed the weight of her words and found no immediate response. The man in the gray suit lowered his gaze slightly, no longer observing, but reflecting, while the woman with the sunglasses removed them. Entirely, her expression now open, no trace of earlier amusement remaining. Alexander glanced at Hannah, a brief exchange of understanding passing between them without words. Then he turned back to the manager. "We will proceed," he said, his tone final, not dismissive, but conclusive, signaling that the moment of explanation had ended and the moment of action had begun. The manager nodded quickly, already reaching for internal systems, his movements efficient, focused, determined to correct what could still be corrected. Behind him, the receptionist stood in silence, her hands clasped together, her gaze fixed on the counter she had once controlled, now fully aware that the decision she made in seconds had reshaped far more than a single interaction. And as the quiet rhythm of the bank slowly began to return, it carried a different weight, a different awareness, because nothing had been raised, nothing had been forced, and yet everything had changed. And in that stillness, the lesson settled, not spoken, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. The quiet rhythm of the bank resumed, but it no longer sounded the same. Every movement now carried a trace of awareness, every glance a hint of reflection, as if the polished floors and glass walls had absorbed what had just unfolded and were holding on to it. Behind the counter, the manager worked with focused precision, his hands moving quickly across the system, confirming entries, updating records. His earlier composure now replaced by a determination to restore what could still be corrected, and within moments, he looked up, his expression steady. "Mrs. Brooks, your ownership status has been formally verified and updated across all active accounts and internal structures." His voice carried clearly, not just to her, but to everyone within earshot, as if acknowledgement now required visibility. Hannah nodded once, a small, measured gesture, not celebratory, not relieved, simply accepting what had always been true. Alexander stood beside her, his posture unchanged, his presence still calm, as if the outcome had never been uncertain, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved, allowing the room to settle fully into the reality it had just resisted. The receptionist remained a few steps back, her hands clasped together, her gaze lowered, not out of instruction, but out of understanding, the weight of her earlier decisions now clear in a way that no explanation could soften. And though no one addressed her directly, the silence around her spoke more than any words could have. The employee who had laughed earlier shifted slightly, his shoulders no longer squared, his confidence replaced by a quiet withdrawal, avoiding the eyes of those who had once shared in the moment. Across the room, the man in the gray suit stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, not with his earlier casual ease, but with a subtle respect, as if leaving the space now required acknowledgement of what had taken place. While the woman with the sunglasses held them loosely in her hand, her expression thoughtful, no trace of amusement remaining. Hannah reached for the folder, closing it gently, her movements as deliberate as when she had first placed it on the counter, and without urgency, she turned slightly toward Alexander, their eyes meeting for a brief second, a silent exchange that needed no words. Then she looked back at the manager. "Thank you," she said softly, and the simplicity of the phrase carried no resentment, no triumph, only closure. The manager inclined his head, understanding that the moment had moved beyond correction, beyond apology, into something that would linger long after the systems were updated and the records aligned. Alexander placed a light hand at the small of Hannah's back, not guiding, not leading, simply present, and together, they turned toward the exit, their steps measured, unhurried, the same quiet confidence that had brought them in now carrying them out. As they moved across the marble floor, the space parted naturally, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, the kind that does not need to be announced. The glass doors rotated once more, letting in a soft wash of daylight, and as they stepped through, the room behind them remained still for a moment longer, holding on to the silence that had defined it. And in that stillness, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that lingered in every corner, that respect, once overlooked, reveals itself not through force, but through truth. And that day, without a raised voice or a single demand, the entire room was reminded exactly what dignity looks like.